There are moments in life when a single question enters our mind, like a soft knock on a door we didn't even realize was closed, asking us to consider something beyond everything we claim to know. And perhaps one of the most unsettling of these questions is this: what happens to the soul of someone who never believed they had one? Imagine for a moment a man who spent his entire existence questioning the invisible, dismissing the sacred, and trusting only what his hands could touch. And now imagine this same man lying on his deathbed, confronted by the quiet certainty that the world he is leaving behind is no longer able to give him the answers he once demanded. It is often in that fragile silence between one breath and the next that the deeper truths begin to reveal themselves in ways we never expected. When a skeptic reaches the end of his earthly journey, he does not suddenly become a different person. The mind still holds its doubts, its habits, its defenses, but the soul, untouched by the arguments of the intellect, begins to rise with a clarity that is both ancient and startling. Many spiritual teachers have whispered that consciousness is like a traveler who wakes from a long dream, and those final moments of life are the thinning veil that lets the first rays of a larger reality seep through. Even the most skeptical heart senses this shift, as if some inner compass turns subtly toward a horizon it never acknowledged before. And it is exactly in this delicate moment that the diary of a dying priest becomes a mirror, not only for believers, but for those who have spent decades rejecting the very idea of a spiritual path. This priest, after 50 years of listening to confessions and guiding souls, wrote in his final days that the human spirit behaves much like a seed. Some seeds fall into fertile soil and flourish in faith. Others fall onto rocky ground and spend a lifetime resisting the idea that they could grow at all. But every seed carries within it a blueprint, a silent memory of the tree it is destined to become. And according to his reflections, the soul of a skeptic, even after years of denying the sacred, begins to remember its own nature when the body prepares to release it. It is not a punishment nor a judgment. It is simply the unveiling of what had always been there, patiently waiting beneath the layers of disbelief. He described how, in those final hours, skepticism doesn't vanish. It softens. It loosens its grip the way a child releases a worn-out toy when something wondrous appears before their eyes. The priest wrote that he had seen countless skeptics reach a point where logic could no longer hold the weight of the mystery that was opening before them. And as he sat beside them, he noticed a kind of quiet awe emerge, a tender curiosity replacing the certainty that once protected them. It was as though the soul itself whispered, "You do not need to believe in me for me to exist." And in that whisper, something within them finally exhaled. He reflected deeply on how the transition from life to what lies beyond is not like stepping into a courtroom, but more like waking from an incredibly vivid dream. Imagine dreaming your entire life that the sky ends where you can see it, only to wake and discover it never had an edge. The priest wrote that even the most skeptical souls begin this waking with a mixture of confusion and wonder, because the moment consciousness slips from the body, it encounters a depth of presence that no argument, no denial, no theory had ever been able to erase. It is not a conversion, it is a homecoming, a return to an awareness that was always quietly glowing beneath the surface of everything we thought we understood. He believed that the experience of this awakening varies from soul to soul, shaped not by beliefs, but by openness. A lifetime of disbelief doesn't block the journey, but it can make the first moments of awakening feel unfamiliar, like entering a room you don't remember building. Yet even in that unfamiliarity, there is a warmth that draws the soul forward, a kind of gentle invitation that needs no explanation. And the priest wrote that this invitation seems to come from a place beyond words, a presence that doesn't demand faith, but simply offers itself, the way sunlight offers itself to anyone who steps outside with open eyes. And so he concluded that the soul of a skeptic does not disappear, nor does it suffer for its doubt. Instead, it encounters the truth of its own existence in the most intimate and undeniable way. And perhaps the greatest surprise, he wrote, is not what the soul sees but what it recognizes, because even the skeptic in that final moment begins to sense that the journey continues, that consciousness cannot be contained by the limits of belief, and that something vast and compassionate has been waiting patiently all along, like a light just beyond the fog, guiding each of us toward a place we have always belonged. And as we follow the priest's quiet reflections deeper into this mystery, we begin to see that the soul's awakening is less like a sudden revelation, and more like the gradual lifting of a mist that had always surrounded us. He wrote that many skeptics, in their final hours, showed an expression he came to know well, something between bewilderment and recognition, as though they were hearing a melody they had forgotten they once loved. He believed that the human soul carries ancient memories, traces of experiences far older than the body, and that these memories stir gently as the physical world begins to fade from view. It is not the shock of confronting something alien, but the strange familiarity of returning to a place we did not realize we had left. The priest described this transition as a kind of unfolding, similar to the way dawn reveals a landscape slowly, brushstroke by brushstroke, until what was once hidden becomes quietly undeniable. He wrote that even those who spent decades insisting that consciousness ends with the body often drifted into a state of serene curiosity as their final moments approached, as if the boundaries of the known world had softened enough for something larger to seep in. And in this softened space he observed an inner shift, a loosening of the tight mental knots that had held their disbelief in place. It was not persuasion, not teaching, not doctrine. It was simply the soul stretching into a wider dimension it had always inhabited without knowing. He reflected on how much of skepticism is shaped not by a rejection of the spiritual, but by experiences of pain, betrayal, or disappointment that harden the heart over time. He wrote that many who denied the existence of the soul were not rejecting truth, but protecting themselves from questions that felt too heavy or too sorrowful to hold. And in those final hours, when the noise of life grows distant and the inner world deepens, those defenses often became quieter, revealing a tenderness that had been hidden beneath years of intellectual armor. The priest believed that this tenderness is the true doorway through which the soul begins to awaken. Not belief, not doctrine, but the simple release of fear. According to his diary, the soul of a skeptic often begins its awakening with an encounter not of sight, but of presence. He described it as a profound sense of being held, as though something vast and compassionate surrounds the consciousness the moment it slips beyond the limits of the physical body. This presence does not introduce itself, does not explain, does not demand understanding. It simply exists with a fullness that leaves no room for doubt or debate. And he wrote that even the most skeptical souls, when touched by this presence, experience a kind of inner quiet that surpasses anything they felt in life, as though they are finally able to rest after a long journey of resistance and questioning. The priest often compared this awakening to the way a person who has been asleep on a long train ride slowly realizes they are approaching their true destination. At first there is disorientation, a moment where the landscape outside the window feels unfamiliar, but gradually recognition begins to seep through, not from memory of the place itself, but from an intuitive knowing that this destination was always part of the journey. He believed that the soul carries within it an internal compass, a pull toward the source of its existence, and that even lifelong skeptics feel this pull once the distractions and defenses of the physical world fall away. He observed that as this inner compass activates, the soul experiences a subtle shift in perception, much like adjusting to light after emerging from darkness. The priest wrote that this adjustment can feel overwhelming at first, especially for those who spent their lives anchored solely in the material. Yet even in this overwhelm, there is a profound sense of safety, as though the soul is being guided by a wisdom far older than any belief system. He described this guidance as gentle, patient, and deeply kind, allowing each soul to awaken at its own pace, without expectation or judgment. For the skeptic, he wrote, this kindness is often the greatest surprise. And he emphasized that the unfolding of awareness after death is not a test of faith, but a recognition of truth. The soul does not ascend or awaken because it believed. It awakens because it exists. And existence in its truest form is not dependent on the boundaries the mind tries to impose. The priest wrote that every soul, believer or skeptic, is like a river flowing inevitably toward the same vast ocean, and that the moment the body releases it, the river begins to remember its source. And what the skeptic discovers in that first stretch of the journey is not a verdict but an invitation into a reality that had been gently waiting, patient as dawn, tender as a whisper, ready to reveal what lies just beyond the edge of everything we once thought we knew. And as we follow the priest's words further into the quiet corridors of this mystery, we begin to understand that the journey of the skeptical soul is not marked by resistance, but by a gradual surrender to something that feels profoundly sincere. He wrote that once the soul begins to awaken, it encounters layers of itself it had never touched during life, much like opening an old journal whose pages contain stories long forgotten. These layers are not memories in the usual sense, but impressions, echoes of experiences, emotions, and truths that the physical mind was too busy or too guarded to explore. And what struck him most was that skeptics, who often valued authenticity above all else, seemed deeply moved by the unmistakable authenticity of this inner unveiling. He reflected that awakening after death is not an event, but a process, similar to the way a traveler adjusts to a new land. Even the air feels different, he wrote, not in the literal sense, but in the sense of an atmosphere saturated with meaning. The priest described this phase as a realm where thoughts no longer form from the mind alone, but from the very essence of the soul. And in that space, even those who spent a lifetime doubting the spiritual begin to feel a resonance, a subtle alignment with something they cannot deny. It is like hearing a familiar voice in a distant crowd, one you didn't know you recognized until it called your name. He wrote that many skeptics arrive in this new awareness, carrying the weight of unanswered questions, not about the universe, but about themselves. Questions like why certain pains shaped their lives, why certain loves stayed or slipped away, why their deepest fears clung so tightly to their journey. And in this expanded state, he observed that the answers do not appear as explanations, but as understandings that bloom from within, the way a seed held in darkness suddenly opens when exposed to light. These understandings do not judge or condemn, they illuminate. And it is in this illumination that the skeptical soul begins to see its own life with a clarity that can feel both startling and tender. The priest believed that this clarity is one of the greatest gifts the soul receives after leaving the body. He compared it to standing at the top of a mountain after a lifetime spent wandering valleys. From this height, everything that once felt fragmented begins to form patterns. Moments of struggle aligning with moments of grace, choices aligning with consequences, and lessons aligning with the quiet wisdom the soul had been collecting all along. He wrote that even the most committed skeptics, upon seeing their lives from this vantage point, often experience a deep sense of relief, as though they were finally able to breathe in a truth they had sensed but never dared to name. He described how this relief often blossoms into something even more powerful: recognition. Recognition that their disbelief was never a barrier, only a path. Recognition that their questioning nature, their longing for evidence, their insistence on truth, were not flaws, but qualities that shaped the very way their soul learned. The priest noted that skeptics often meet this recognition with an unexpected gentleness toward themselves, realizing that the journey of doubt had carried its own form of devotion, a devotion to integrity, to sincerity, to a world that felt honest. And once this gentleness takes hold, he wrote, the soul begins to open even further, like a flower slowly unfolding to the warmth of dawn. He observed that as the soul continues its awakening, it encounters a realm where communication is not spoken, but felt, a place where understanding is immediate, where presence itself is the language. And for the skeptical soul, he wrote, this form of communication can feel astonishingly liberating. No more debates, no more defenses, no need to articulate the questions that once defined their identity. Everything becomes direct, intuitive, unmistakably clear. The priest compared it to finally being able to see with both eyes after living one's entire life with one closed. Suddenly depth appears everywhere, revealing dimensions of reality that were invisible before. And so he concluded that the skeptical soul does not awaken into a world that contradicts its life, but into one that completes it. It discovers that its journey through doubt was not an obstacle to truth, but a preparation for it. And in this realization, the soul begins to move forward with a sense of quiet wonder, carried by a presence that asks for nothing and offers everything. The priest wrote that in these early stages of awakening, every soul, believer or skeptic, moves toward the same horizon, drawn by the same gentle pull, guided by a light that does not force itself upon them, but waits patiently, like the deep glow of a lantern glimpsed through fog, offering a path that has always been there, just beyond the reach of the world we once knew. And as the priest reached the final pages of his diary, he wrote that the most profound moment in the awakening of any soul, skeptical or devout, comes when it realizes that the journey was never about being right, but about becoming whole. He believed that once the initial layers of confusion dissolve, the soul enters a state of quiet expansion, a widening of awareness that feels like stepping into a vast field after spending a lifetime in a single room. In this expanse, he wrote, the soul begins to sense the presence of something both intimate and infinite, a presence that surrounds it with a love so unmistakable that even the strongest doubts melt away like frost in morning light. And it is in this love that the soul discovers what it had been searching for all along, even when it believed it was searching for nothing. He reflected that the greatest surprise for the skeptical soul is not the existence of the spiritual realm, but the kindness it encounters there. For years, skepticism may have been a shield built from disappointment or disillusionment, yet in this higher awareness, the soul realizes that no shield was ever needed. The presence that greets it does not recount mistakes, does not measure belief, does not demand allegiance. Instead, it offers understanding, as though it has known every chapter of the soul's story, every fear, every question, every attempt to make sense of the world, and embraces all of it with a compassion beyond anything the human heart could imagine. And in this embrace, the soul feels something it may never have felt fully in life, unconditional belonging. He wrote that this sense of belonging becomes the foundation for the next stage of the journey, a stage that feels less like an ascent and more like a deep remembering. The soul begins to recall its own origin, not as a memory from the mind, but as a truth that rises from its very essence. The priest compared this remembering to recognizing a familiar face in a crowd. You may not recall the details immediately, but the knowing is instantaneous. And in this recognition, the skeptical soul experiences a profound shift, realizing that the doubts it carried in life were not signs of disconnection, but part of a sacred longing for truth. This longing, he believed, was what ultimately led every soul back to the source. He described how, as this remembering deepens, the soul begins to understand the tapestry of its life with remarkable clarity. Events that once felt random reveal their purpose. Relationships once filled with tension unveil their hidden gifts. Moments of suffering reveal the seeds of compassion they planted beneath the surface. The priest wrote that this understanding does not excuse pain, but transforms it, turning every wound into a window, every question into a doorway, every moment of disbelief into a stepping stone on the soul's greater path. And with this transformation comes a sense of peace so profound that the soul feels as though it is finally resting in the rhythm it was always meant to follow. He observed that at this stage, the soul, regardless of belief, moves toward the light, not because it is commanded, but because it is drawn. This light, he wrote, is not a place but a presence, a consciousness so luminous and gentle that the soul approaches it the way a child approaches the arms of someone it has trusted since the beginning of time. The priest believed that this movement is the true essence of spiritual evolution, not a journey outward, but a returning inward, a quiet merging with the deeper truth that has been accompanying us through every breath, every doubt, every moment we thought we were alone. He concluded that the soul of a skeptic, perhaps more than any other, experiences a unique kind of awe in this final unfolding. Because for the skeptic, awakening comes not as confirmation of a belief, but as the unveiling of a truth that transcends belief itself. It is the realization that consciousness cannot be limited by disbelief, that love does not require permission to reach us, and that the deepest parts of our being have always been connected to something far greater than what the physical world could ever reveal. And in that realization, the soul finally feels free free from fear, free from doubt, free from the weight of questions that no longer need answers because the truth now speaks directly to its essence. And so the priest ended his diary with a message not only for believers, but for those who have questioned, doubted, resisted, or wondered from afar. He wrote that the journey does not end with the body, nor does it depend on belief to continue. Every soul, whether wrapped in faith or wrapped in doubt, is guided by the same light, welcomed by the same love, and invited into the same infinite unfolding. And perhaps the greatest comfort of all is knowing that the soul will recognize this truth when its time comes, not as a shock, but as a homecoming. So as we hold these reflections close, let us walk our days with a little more gentleness, a little more curiosity, and a little more openness to the possibility that we are more than we appear. And if these words stirred something within you, share your thoughts in the comments and join this journey with us by subscribing, so that we may continue to explore the mysteries that call softly to every soul.